Good morning and welcome to the VLV's Spring Conference. It's very good to see so many people here, and of course we are so grateful to our loyal members for continuing to support the VLV as we work really hard to try to ensure that the citizens' interests are at the forefront of discussions about what's happening in the media world and broadcasting more generally. So thank you for coming, and I should also give thanks to the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, who are our supporters, loyal supporters. We're really grateful for the continuing support that they give us. Now, just one or two sort of the normal kind of warnings. Emergency exits are there. In the event of any kind of emergency, you assemble outside the front of the building. I think that's it in terms of those messages. So let's turn to the first session. And I'm extremely pleased to welcome Dame Caroline Dinenage as chair of the Culture, Media and Sport Committee in the House of Commons. It's an extremely important time, of course, with the media bill passing through Parliament. I shall leave our chair for the session, Torin Douglas, to give a full introduction to Caroline. But let me just introduce Torin. Well, do I need to? He's known to you all, media commentator, former BBC media editor, former journalist in campaign and elsewhere. It's sort of too long a list to mention. So I'll just now hand you over to the safe hands of Torin to get this session going. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin, and good morning, everybody. And it's great to see so many familiar faces and people who I know will be keeping Caroline to account. So I know I'm not the only person who's going to be asking questions. Dame Caroline Dinenage, as Colin said, is the chair of the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. She's been the Conservative MP for Gosport in Hampshire since 2010, and she was elected chair of the committee in May last year. And it's worth pointing out that this committee and its views are cross-party. She was previously Minister of State for Digital and Culture in the DCMS from February 20 to 2021. And before that, she was Minister of State at the Department of Health and Social Care. And she's also been a Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at both the Department of Work and Pensions and at the Department for Education, where her responsibilities were women, equalities and early years. Her own early years were spent in a broadcasting household as the daughter of Fred Dinenage, who many people here may remember, the Southern TV, TVS and Meridian TV presenter, but he was perhaps best known for presenting the long-running children's television programme, How, and he spent 38 years as a regional news presenter. Dame Caroline was just 19 when she set up a successful manufacturing company, which she ran for over 20 years. So I'd love to hear her views about The Apprentice and Lord Sugar, but I think she's going to be addressing other issues this morning. She's going to speak for about 15 minutes or so. I'll then ask her some questions, and then we'll throw it open to you. So please welcome Dame Caroline Dinenage.
Thank you, Torin, for that lovely introduction. As a political figure, ladies and gentlemen, you never quite know how you're going to be introduced. Our Foreign Secretary once went to a school where he was introduced by one little girl as the right horrible David Cameron. So you often feel quite blessed if you've managed to get away with it being introduced without any of those sort of dramas. So listen, I'd really like to thank you for inviting me to come and speak at your spring conference. I feel very honoured to be here. As Torin said, I'm the chair of the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee in the House of Commons. What does that mean? Well, you know, our job is to hold the government, the Culture, Media and Sport Department to account and to scrutinise what they get up to, but also we can look more broadly across government and elsewhere what's going on and call people in to give evidence. At the moment we're looking at things like film and high-end television and how that's all faring in the wake of the SAG-AFTRA strikes last summer and grassroots music venues which are closing at the rate of 2 a week at the moment across the UK. So quite a broad remit. I was elected the chair of the committee in May 2023. As Torin said, it's cross-party. You have to be elected by your peers from all different political parties. So it's a really good way of working collaboratively across all different opinions and ideas in order to make recommendations to the government and others. Seems a long time ago, actually, May 2023, but just to take you back, just to rewind you, it was just after Match of the Day had been broadcast with no host, no pundits and no regular commentators following the furore over Gary Lineker's use of social media. Remember that? Richard Sharp had just announced his resignation as the BBC chair. Only a couple of weeks after my election, we had the Schofield thing. We had Philip Schofield left this morning, and the committee and much of the media was looking at what was going on at ITV. And so it was against this backdrop. It almost felt like fate was conspiring against me. It was against that backdrop that the very first session we had, as with me and the chair of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, was the draft media bill, which the government had published at the end of March. The aim of the bill, as you know, is to reform the legal framework for regulation of public service broadcasting, for on-demand programmes, for radio, providing new powers for Ofcom. My committee were given the opportunity to scrutinise the draft bill and publish our views, aiming to make improvements before the bill was presented to Parliament. And to be fair, the government did accept most of our committee's recommendations, and when the media bill received its second reading last November, the committee's work on the draft bill was praised by both government ministers and opposition front benches, so we must be doing something wrong if everyone likes us. And that simply wouldn't have happened, I think, without the input of stakeholders. We listened very carefully to people from a range of different views and backgrounds, including the voice of the listener and viewer. Colin came in to give us evidence. He was very good. I said to him this morning when I arrived that this was his opportunity to take his revenge on me. But I think what made our job easier is that there remains a broad consensus that this bill is necessary. In some parts covered by the bill, it's actually quite desperately necessary. It does most things right. And it is important that it does receive royal assent, that it doesn't get derailed. So the bill is currently with the House of Lords, which may mean that things will change yet. But in the meantime, I would like to highlight a few areas where our recommendations were not accepted and explain why we made them and how we feel on the whole about it. The first thing I want to talk about is genres. So the changes to the public service broadcasting remit in this bill regarding genres are quite significant. It removes, other than news and current affairs, a requirement to offer content in religion, in arts, in children's programming, replaces it with an obligation to provide programming that reflects the lives and concerns of the UK's different communities and cultural interests and traditions. During our scrutiny of the draft of the bill, the committee found that these changes were something that the PSBs themselves didn't want to linger on. It wasn't something that they wanted to talk about very much, which made us a little suspicious. It made us wonder whether they are indeed the right ones. It's true that other broadcasters do now provide some of what we regard as public service content. For example, Sky Arts, now free to view, which was a great move. But not all genres are served in that way. And we know that when quotas for children's TV had been removed in the past, it led to a significant reduction in the production of original British kids' TV. I suppose I should declare an interest at that point as the daughter of a children's television presenter. I know how worrying that can be. Sorry, okay, I won't do it again. Now, I know the removal of genres is a concern to the voice of the listener and the viewer because Colin told me so, and I listened when Colin tells me things. And when the committee echoed our concerns, we did so recommending that there should be obligations on the public service broadcasters to provide specific genres of content. The government disagreed, but they did amend the bill so that the range of genres that are still relevant to the contribution, there's a range of genres that were still relevant to the contribution to fulfilling the PSB's remit. But my worry is that it's a kind of removing specific genres will lead to a dilution of what makes public service broadcasting distinctive. And that's important because while commercial streamers do what they do very well, they don't always offer all the things that British people want on their telly. So that's genres. The other thing I want to talk to you about is prominence. This is where we get right into the weeds, everybody. It's clear that it must be 100% easy to find our public service broadcast content when audiences want to access it. I think that goes without saying. The harder it is to find, the less likely that it will be watched. So that's fairly straightforward. But what prominence looks like varies considerably from device to device and from platform to platform. And so this actually is a really important debate. And so we ended up getting into the weeds as to whether we keep the existing descriptor that PSB's prominence should be appropriate, or whether we should change it to significant. And that is quite a significant debate because, we recommended significant because we felt that appropriate was open to interpretation too much. The government disagreed. They stuck with appropriate. And in the Lords, I understand that the Lord Bishop of Leeds has made things even more complicated by suggesting a third option of substantial. So I know this all sounds a bit technical, but actually, words matter, details matter when it comes to legislation. The important thing is to ensure that public service broadcasters are always available and they're always easy to find. And that's effectively what we are seeking to do with this legislation. And that's why we have to choose our words really, really carefully. This debate is clearly going to go on as the bill progresses, so you're going to hear a lot more about significant, appropriate and substantial, I'm afraid, everybody. We supported the changes to the listed events regime. However, the bill does not currently cover regulation of the digital rights for listed events. This is something we were concerned about. We know that the Olympic Games in Tokyo, for example, the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham, for example, it was actually the audience for digital clips that was higher in some cases than the live viewing figures. But without regulatory protection, these moments risk being lost behind a paywall. And one of our great Paralympians, Baroness Tanni Gray-Thompson, said in the Lords on this, I'm going to quote her because there's no one says it better, if no reference to digital on-demand rights is included, it seems unlikely that 2 live streams free to air, but with no catch-up or digital clips available for free, would be sufficient for audiences. 2 years ago, our committee called on the government to review extending this protection for listed events to digital and to on-demand content. And the government said it would carry out a review. This review closed in December 2022, but still hasn't been published. So an optimist might say that the government may still change their view on this, and we're very hopeful that they will. The next area I want to talk about is radio. Now, I know you have a session on radio in the digital age this afternoon, so I'm not going to labour on that too much. I'm going to be quite brief. Radio remains popular. We know it does. 88% of adults tune into a radio station each week. That includes me. This has been helped by continued growth in commercial radio. People love it. It gives you really good local content. For some people, it is a great friend. It's a great source of information. But we know that radio has gone through a considerable change, and audiences are choosing to listen less via radio sets and more now via the internet and via smart speakers. Ofcom figures suggest that smart speakers and internet listening now account for a quarter of all time spent listening to live radio. In 2023, 42% of households had access to a smart speaker. Now, during our consideration of the draft media bill, we supported the inclusion of provisions relating to radio. We asked ministers not to lose sight of the importance of radio for local news and information. Now, as many of you will know, in 2022, the BBC announced that it would be reducing its local radio provision in 39 local radio stations, at the same time removing resources into digital, online, local news services. They were also, at that point, recruited 130 journalists into local news, including 70 to form an investigative network. In early January of 2023, the committee recommended that the BBC reconsider these plans, but they continue. At the same time that this is why I find this concerning. At the same time that the BBC is cutting some of its regional provision, it's expanding its local online news service, and that means it's competing with the websites of some of our print media who are already struggling to survive in the modern world. In my area, it would be the Portsmouth News, which is still a daily news publication, despite the fact that so many have gone into a weekly. It's a form of news that people rely upon and they trust. And their business case, their business model is at risk because of the competition that will now be put in place for the local digital provision by the BBC. I did put this to Tim Davey when he appeared before the committee in March. I said to him that at a stroke, this policy is removing the local radio that people are dedicated to and that is really important in their lives, and undermining the very delicate ecosystem of local print media. Now, I may have said it in not so many words. I may have said that he's blowing up the ecosystem. Because I was a little cross at the time. In response, Tim pushed back. He said, the idea that we're blowing up the ecosystem or that my vision has been to collapse local radio is just not true. And he talked about going into partnership with the local press. But this is something that we really want to keep an eye on as a committee. The only time we hear really positive words about these changes is when we haul the BBC in to discuss them. And we do keep pushing them on this, because this delicate ecosystem of local media is so precious. And I don't say that just because my dad was a local TV presenter for so many decades. I say that because I know so many people in my own constituency for whom local media is it's a friend, it's a lifeline, and we have to be really careful about damaging it. The third topic I'd like to talk about is the impact of changing audience behaviour. Over the last 10 to 15 years, competition for viewers has grown from the global streamers with the large budgets providing on-demand services, so the likes of Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney+, and the video sharing and social media platforms, your YouTubes, your TikToks, for example. The weekly reach of broadcast TV among all people has steadily declined from 91% in 2017 to 79% in 2022. Now, I speak from experience. I have a 16-year-old and a 21-year-old. They virtually never watch mainstream terrestrial TV anymore. But it's not just the young. The audience aged over 64 watch 8% less broadcast TV in 2022 than it did in 2021. So everybody is moving into the digital world. And the trend is reflected in the growth of viewers watching ITVX and iPlayer, the digital forms of those services. The PSBs have to make sure their content is where the audience is, and that means making sure that they do have digital platforms that provide content on demand. And at the same time, they have to ensure that those without internet access can still get hold of that same content. So to not do either obviously risks undermining the whole support for the public service broadcasting. You only have to look at the situation at Channel 4 to give you an example of that. In 2022, Channel 4 linear advertising revenue fell by 8%, while its digital advertising revenue grew by 14%. This year, they launched a 5-year strategy to be a digital-first public service streamer by 2030. And a champion of independent TV and film production. But at the same time, they have to make redundancies, and they've sold their Horse Ferry Road HQ in London. So that's how the world is changing, but not just in a London-centric way. As part of our inquiry into minority languages, we heard from MG Alapa, who provide content in Scottish Gaelic, and they are facing very similar challenges in how to make this transition to digital that suits the modern world. Public sector broadcasting provides the training ground for so much talent that makes so many fantastic programmes. Peaky Blinders, Happy Valley, Derry Girls, Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, Line of Duty. We've all got our favourites. But there is clearly going to be a challenge for public sector broadcasters to produce these stories, these really distinctive UK stories in the current environment, but also to keep investing in digital. And this is a concern for me, not least because if you've read my committee's recent report into creator remuneration, which came out a week or so ago, you'll see it refers to evidence that we've heard that more than 2/3 of film and TV workers are not currently working. This obviously was affected by the industrial action in the US, but also the funding challenges facing PSBs, such as the BBC and Channel 4. So does it come from reducing staff, or does it come from less commissioning? How do PSBs do this and still keep their audiences happy? There's loads of challenges that are facing our PSBs in the modern world. Does it mean that we should accept the BBC's proposal to put adverts on podcasts only when accessed through a third party as inevitable? Or how much of a slippery slope does that represent when seen through the lens of people in commercial radio? We should all be concerned about how this might play out in the future, and my committee's current inquiry into British film and high-end TV is asking some of these questions. So you can see how so many of these inquiries that we do that initially appear like they wouldn't have any intersection actually all relate to each other. We can't talk about funding broadcasters without mentioning the TV licence. This year's rise after 2 years of a freeze comes in the context of the current pressure on household finances, a decline in the number of households with a TV licence falling by 400,000 last year, and increasingly competitive media landscape. We know that this has implications. The BBC has set out a £500 million saving and reinvestment plan and is looking to save a further £200 million. Tim Davie told us in March, we have had our budget cut by 30% in the 10 years to 2020, so we can't do everything. But at the same time as announcing the increase in the licence fee, the Secretary of State announced a review of the BBC funding model. I welcome this, and particularly that the review is going to be supported by a panel of experts, because this is a question that really does need to take in a very wide range of views. We've been promised a report into the funding review by the autumn of this year, and like you, I'm very keen to see the outcome. But when the Culture, Media and Sport Committee last looked at this subject in 2021, before I was the chair of the committee, it recognised that while there are problems with the licence fee model, none of the existing alternatives are sufficiently attractive to justify recommending replacing it. They concluded that the licence fee remains the preferred option for the next charter period, and colleagues in the Lords also produced a report on the BBC future funding in 2022. And they discussed the various options. They looked at a universal household levy, like they have in Germany, I think, a ring-fenced income tax, reforming the current licence fee to provide discounts for low-income households, and said each of these merits serious attention. And they called on the government to hold national consultations before proposing changes to the funding model. The debate needs to involve everybody. The BBC is our BBC, and it needs to involve the public, organisations, of course, like the Voice of the Listener and the Viewer, and the consideration of what we all want from the BBC before any final decision is made on how to fund it. And finally, I want to say a few words about the role of the committee. I've highlighted a few of the challenges and some of the work that we've been up to, which brings me back to where I started. And I think pretty much the week that I joined the committee, Richard Sharp's resignation as the chair of the BBC. Last December, we carried out a pre-appointment hearing with the government's preferred candidate to the BBC chair, Dr. Samir Shah. And afterwards, we concluded that while Dr. Shah was appointable as chair, we did have concerns about his willingness to offer his opinions and his thoughts on fundamental changes and issues facing the BBC, and whether or not he was able to provide a robust challenge to its leadership. Now, don't get me wrong, he seemed like a really nice man. He's clearly very, very bright. He was very impressive, and maybe we got off on the wrong foot. It was very, very early in his tenure. So we've given him a chance to have a think a bit more about his views on some of these things, and we've asked to see him again in the near future to have a look at what progress he's made on his priorities and to explore how the BBC's managing its present and future challenges. And these challenges really do include matters such as impartiality, editorial standards, and complaints, particularly on things like news and current affairs in the context of two wars in Ukraine and Israel-Gaza, in the context of elections and the potential for AI-generated disinformation, and all the challenges I've mentioned today as well. It's a really, really important time. So the BBC's ambitions for its continuing transition to a digital future, including iPlayer and BBC Sounds, how it will continue to provide local news on radio and online, how it will do so given the debate on the TV licence fee. Now, I know we don't have time to answer all those questions today, but that's some of the things that we need to think about. And that's why I'm really keen to hear from you, because, as I say, the role of our committee is to hold the government to account, to take on board a variety of different views and opinions, and when we do have people in front of us to give evidence to our committee, I do like to be able to present them with some of the questions that we've heard when we've been out and about on our travels. So thank you very much for listening to me today, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Caroline. I think an awful lot of what you've said will be music to the ears of people here. You've taken on board an awful lot of what the VLV believes and says. I think you are very robust in your questioning, and so people really know they've been questioned when they come to your committee. And also, you are quite outspoken afterwards, the Samir Shah and other things. You say what you think, which is great. Do you actually have any impact as a committee?
Well, I mean, we do. I mean, the very first piece of work we did when I was chair, as I said, was scrutinising the draft media bill. We actually did the pre-legislative scrutiny of that piece of legislation, so the government gave us that draft bill to go through line by line and to make our recommendations. So, which was a display of trust in the committee's ability to be able to take on board a variety of different viewpoints and reflect them in our recommendations, which is really, really important. And then, yes, I mean, over the last year, there's been a number of examples of things where we literally have changed the dial on a whole range of subjects. So, for example, as I say, we started taking evidence on film and high-end TV towards the tail end of last year, and it became very clear. Well, actually, we started taking the written evidence way before that, at the tail end of last summer, and it became very, very clear very quickly that the one thing that everybody was asking for was tax breaks for lower budget British films. There are tax breaks for big budget US Hollywood movies, which is why we've got all these incredible movie production stages setting up all the way around sort of the M25 area. But my concern is that it was drowning out British independent film. So very, very quickly it became clear that there was this sort of gap at the lower end of the spending budget, and we wrote to the PM about that early doors. We didn't want to wait until the committee had concluded our thoughts, and so in the budget they extended the tax breaks to lower budget films. So we're already beginning to make a difference.
What can you do if they haven't accepted what you say? So you've mentioned the digital issue on listed events. You're still hopeful, but is there anything more you can do? What's going to happen with the media bill? What other stages can it be influenced or changed?
So we did make a number of changes to suggestions to the media bill, many of which the government did take on board, but there are a few sticking points. This whole, I know it gets really into the weeds with this whole prominence thing, this sort of significant and substantial and appropriate, and then people tie you up in words. So John Whittingdale, he was stand-in minister while Julia Lopez was on maternity leave. He came in and he said that, Caroline, I'm very confused because appropriate can be significant, but significant is not always appropriate. And my brain at that point was
beginning. It's very yes minister, isn't it?
My brain was beginning to melt. But yeah, so the stage of the bill we are at the moment, it's gone through the Commons. It's now in the House of Lords, and that's where we've had this sort of suggestion that we now go for substantial. And the House of Lords is where a lot of stuff really begins to happen, because they do go through legislation line by line. it's about to go to committee stage in the House of Lords. So it's gone through second reading. Committee stage is where they literally go through it line by line and make recommendations. And the great thing about the Lords is you do have people in there who have a wealth of really sort of hardcore experience at the front line of their own professions, and nothing ever comes out of the House of Lords exactly as it went in. When I was a health minister, you've heard at the beginning of this that I was a health minister for a couple of years. I had a piece of legislation quite early on in my tenure. One of my officials said to me, Caroline, we just need to make a little amendment to the Mental Capacity Act. It's just to around deprivation of liberty safeguards. It's very non-contentious. Everybody is in favour of doing this because it's going to make the whole system much more transparent and straightforward. We're starting it in the House of Lords, where it left with 65 amendments, because the House of Lords do scrutinise everything from a range of different viewpoints, and they will look at it very carefully. So that's a really good opportunity to change the dial.
You mentioned Bishop Nick Baines. Did he mention adding religion into the genre? I know we worked together on the Sanford St Martin Trust, and that's one of those issues. But are you not worried that actually now the genre aren't protected as they should be, and that ship has sailed? Well,
I mean, there are some. They have made some tightening of the legislation, so it's not the end of the world. But we are, our role in the committee is to, to push for the exemplar. We want to go for the absolute 100% option, and the government's role is to pursue what they see as the most workable, I guess, for them. But we will obviously push. The thing is, I think fundamentally the most important thing to say about this media bill is that it is necessary, and it has to be delivered before we enter another general election. We have to get it over the line, because there is so much good stuff in this legislation and so much stuff that's really, really necessary. What we can't do is bog it down too much in we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Let's put it in those terms. So we have to. There will be a point where we'll just say, let's just let it go, which is what we did in the Commons. Understand.
Ofcom today has announced a warning shot across the broadcasters' bows about impartiality and the fact that DB News has had 11 complaints upheld against it, and making clear that they're having to be tougher. But she was given quite a good grilling by Justin Webb on the Today programme this morning, and a lot of us weren't particularly convinced. I mean, she came back very smoothly, but actually an awful lot of us think that Ofcom actually is slightly too close to the government and does not stand up enough for viewers and listeners.
I mean, they've published two pieces of work this morning that have come out, neither of which I've had a chance to look through in any detail at all, but they've published their guidance notes about due impartiality. I don't know, you've had a chance to read it.
So VLV, good old Sophie Chalk, has actually been through line by line, and it was very hard to spot what the changes actually are. So basically, it's warning the broadcasters that they've got to be even more concerned about it in an election period. But as Justin pointed out, they have not yet used any sanctions at all. Yes. And she did not seem to be threatening many sanctions. So what can you do about that? I mean, we've had people at Andrew Neil yesterday in the House of Lords saying he just cannot understand how GB News is allowed to have these political presenters. We've had Stuart Purvis saying that there's now a two-tier system of impartiality, which she rejected today on the Today programme. What do you feel, and what can you do?
So this is interesting. They also published, I think today or yesterday, is this audience attitudes towards politicians presenting programmes on TV and radio. I don't know if you've had a chance to see this. And at the back, this is how it, I mean, again, I'm not going to tell you I've read this line by line because I haven't, but at the back it concludes this. It says, I'm going to take my glasses off for this point. This is the age I am now. I have to take my glasses off to read something that's close up. Overall, while there was no consensus for preventing politicians from presenting current affairs content, participants suggested a range of mitigations that could help alleviate concerns about audiences being misled and ensure due impartiality. And there are 5 things. Make it easier to visually differentiate between current affairs and news, telling audiences that a politician is presenting and disclosing their party, making it clearer who counts as a politician, preventing politicians from interviewing members of their own party, and ensuring politicians present alternative points of view robustly and respectfully. They all sound like very sensible suggestions to me. In some cases, obviously I do a lot of interviews with a lot of people, and I've done interviews on GB News, and I have been interviewed by other politicians on GB News, but not about political issues. So I was interviewed by Esther McVeigh and Philip Davis about a campaign I've been running to create a children's cancer task force out of a constituency case that I've been working with, and they were the first station to pick it up and gave us an enormous amount of coverage, and as a result the government have announced a children's cancer task force. I'm chairing it, and it's already started. So sometimes actually it can work in a very productive way, but I do think that these sort of recommendations make a lot of sense.
When do you next grill Ofcom?
We tend to get them in. A couple of times a year, so they should be coming in fairly shortly. I haven't got the exact date in front of me, but it will be in the next.
Will you be as robust with them as you were with Samir Shah and some other people?
I don't think we were robust with Samir, but we just. I thought he was charming. I thought he was he came across as a really decent man, and he's clearly a very smart and experienced man. The only thing that we were concerned about was the fact we asked him on a few just sort of basic questions of kind of ethics. Do you think it's appropriate for members of your board to be a serving member of a political party? And he wouldn't answer the question. He didn't know. And I think you have to have a view on those things. And quite frankly, I don't mind what your view is as long as you can substantiate it. So if he'd have said, my personal view is no. I think actually if you take a role on the board of a PSB like the BBC, you, at that point maybe just sort of relinquish your membership for that period. You can always pick it up again afterwards. There's no problem with people having a range of different political views, but I think probably just for the optics of it, not a great idea. But I'm very happy to hear other people's viewpoints on that, and as long as they substantiate them with the thought. But what I don't really like is people not having a viewpoint because they're worried that it might offend. I think people shouldn't try and sit on the fence in issues like that. I'm sorry.
Some of us took out of, possibly wrongly, the message that he might not be tough enough on the management of the BBC, rather not tough enough standing up for the BBC against government who have been interfering and cutting the licence fee and so on. And since he's the first person who's actually had broadcast experience to be chair of the BBC, that was a message some of us may have wrongly taken out. What is your view about that?
I think that's why he seems like an excellent person to do the job, because he does have all that experience. He's got a lifetime of experience. So on paper he is a great candidate, and we do want him to feel that he has the strength to be able to hold everybody to account, to be able to let his voice be heard, and I'm sure he does. That's why we've given him 3 months to, but it's very difficult when you come and do these interviews in front of a select committee. It's easy for me. I was a government minister for 7 years. On average I did it about 8 times a year, so it's, but I think, for someone who's never done it before, it's probably quite intimidating. And at that point he hadn't been appointed. It was a pre-appointment hearing, so he didn't have any of the architecture of the BBC to prep him for that interview and to help him think through what potential questions might be coming down the track. Let's be fair. So that's why we've said, come back to us once
you've... Do you have a date yet?
Yeah. So we said once he'd started the job, which I think he officially started at the beginning of April, didn't he? And we've said once you've done the job for 3 months, will back and have a chat with us then, and that will give us a better idea.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to open it up to the floor, and Paddy Barwise, can we have a microphone here first, please?
He's written it down. That's always a bad sign.
Do you know Paddy Barwise has written a book with Peter York about how everybody's being nasty to the BBC. So there you go.
Thank you, Torin. I'd like to commend what you said about prominence and listed events. Okay, that those are important things for the future of public service broadcasting, but there's a bigger issue, which is funding. and I won't ask you about the BBC, because obviously that's going to be looked at this year, is funding models. What appears not to be on the agenda is the possibility of also following the German system by having an independent body involved in the setting of the level of BBC funding, the KEF they have in Germany, I assume your committee will be looking at that as well as the funding models. On the commercial PSB side, there's a big issue which no one is talking about and might be a good topic next time you're grilling Ofcom, and that is rather nerdish, but actually it's 100 million a year or so, more important probably than prominence and listed events, and that is to do with the unequal rules on the amount of advertising airtime that the PSBs are allowed to sell compared to the non-PSBs. And as you may know, in 2011, the Lords Committee recommended levelling down the amount of advertising. Ofcom ducked facing up to it then. It's come up again more recently. Ofcom's own experts recommended levelling the playing field, and they've bottled it again. So it's quite a nerdish issue, but it's 100 million a year, sort of to the bottom line.
And your question is?
My question is, will you please grill Ofcom about that?
I love a nerdy issue, Paddy. I love it. That's why I get horribly interested in the whole appropriate and substantial and suitable and all and all these other words. Yes, I think this is exactly the sort of thing that is really useful. I've brought with me Duma, who's over there furiously writing. Duma, wave at everybody. Yeah, that's the person you need to go up to after the event. Duma is the.
Don't let him leave before I've caught him.
So I've just wildly thrown Duma under a bus. He's the clerk of my committee that is responsible for our media work, and he's brilliant, and will be squirreling all this away for when we have the appropriate people in front of us.
Let's move on. We've got a question over there, thanks. And if somebody takes...
Thanks. Tim Wilson, Media Policy Consultant. A really quick point and a really quick question. The really quick point is you mentioned the proposal for the BBC to run ads around podcasts on third-party platforms in the UK, and you said that was concerned to commercial radio. Just to make sure you're aware, there are a lot of people in the independent podcast production sector that are also really concerned about that because, as you know, that's a really new, vibrant, diverse sector, and a lot of particularly the new entrants really rely on the money through podcast ads. So for the sort of something of the scale of the BBC to get into that market, which is a relatively new one, is a real concern to them as well. My question was actually around Channel 4 and its out of London commitments. You'll know that Ofcom's reviewing Channel 4's licence at the moment, and it's proposed keeping at 35% the obligation to commission outside the M25. Given that Channel 4's got its own 50% commitment that it's had for quite a few years and is continuing with that and has its new out-of-London hubs and all of that infrastructure, do you think Ofcom should be actually raising the bar on that and actually sort of bedding that in and actually saying that actually the new level is 50%?
Okay, thank you. Let me just quickly go back to your first point. I think it's a really good one, because, and it goes back to my point about this delicate ecosystem. At the moment, we have got this ecosystem of commercial radio. We've got, as you say, podcasts, a really emerging sort of source of information and entertainment. We've got, as I mentioned in my words earlier, you've got local news media and local radio. And my concern is that the BBC are stopping doing some of the things that they are brilliant at, that people really value, and trampling over into everyone else's spheres and upsetting this ecosystem. And that was what I put to Tim in probably not a very particularly articulate way, but I was just sort of trying to express my frustration about this. I just think that they should really, really think through this model really carefully, because otherwise, you risk upsetting a very delicate ecosystem in a way that may not necessarily be able to ever be recreated. That was the first point. The second thing about Channel 4, look, I think we need to give... this may not be a popular view, but I think we need to give Channel 4 some slack. now. They've been through the ringer in the last few years in terms of, the big question mark over privatisation. I didn't think they should be privatised, but that was a hugely difficult period for them all. They have, had a big move up to Leeds and selling of, a big piece of London estate. There are a lot of changes, a lot of challenges. The advertising revenue, as I say, is depleting quite rapidly, and this big move onto digital. I think they've got a lot going on. We did call Alex in front of the committee on a regular basis as well. So I think I wouldn't want to sort of move the goalposts for Channel 4 at the moment. They're doing, they're doing a great job under difficult circumstances, and I just think we need to sort of keep an eye and give them a bit of breathing space.
Just to pick up on podcasts, VLV has pointed out that podcasts are unregulated, even though video streaming is, and this is an anomaly. Is that something of concern to you? Is it something you can pick up and do something about?
Yeah, I mean, it is a concern to me because it is such a huge emerging form of news and information. And and as I said in my speech, I didn't have it written down. I said that bit without reading it. My 16-year-old and my 21-year-old get all their information now. Literally all they do. My 21-year-old watches stuff online and listens to podcasts, and that's virtually how he gets all his information. I mean,
So what can you do?
I just think we have to make sure, when our job, we don't do anything. As a committee, we challenge those who do things, which is great. Having been a minister where you do have to do things all the time, it's lovely to be in the position to offer the challenge rather than to have to come up with a solution. But
Is it saying it can be tacked onto the media bill?
I think it's too late for that, but I do think it is something that we do need to be, and actually, Torin, you don't always need legislation for people to start acting in a certain way. There are some provisions within the online safety bill as well, which also comes under Ofcom, and various other bits of legislation. I think it's really important to look at what legislation's out there already, what needs to be applied or tweaked in a slightly different way. You don't always need primary legislation. Sometimes, secondary legislation can do a job very, very well. So there's a range of options.
We've got three questions in the middle here, so I'll take all three at once. I've no idea if they have any connection between them at all, but we've only got till past, so I want to get through a few more. Yep.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Holly Aylett from the UK Coalition for Cultural Diversity, and thanks so much for your presentation. I wondered, following Alan Rusbridge's expose of the kind of politicisation of appointments, both the BBC and the Ofcom, what's the role and what is ongoing in terms of the committee in trying to hold the government to task for what was some quite scandalous shenanigans, and which seem to be ongoing, particularly in relation to, say, Robbie Gibb?
Yep. Okay. Well, I'll do the others first, and then Carol here first. Microphone there. Yeah.
Carol Tongue, UKCCD. 80% of children and young people, Dame Caroline, you've mentioned today, are on YouTube and TikTok, and simultaneously we have insufficient funding for culturally relevant film and television, and I hope that's something that's being considered in the ongoing study that you're doing. The Children's Media Foundation and others, like ourselves, have said that all players in our audiovisual ecology, including streamers, we should now look at how they all make a contribution in terms of an investment of maybe 1% of their revenues into something that might replace the young audience content fund that now has lapsed. I know that's a big jump from what you've said this morning, but maybe that's something that your committee can consider as a consultation in the future.
Got that point. And if you pass it to Alex behind you.
Hi Caroline, it's Alex Farber from The Times. I'm aware that the committee's voiced its concerns in the past about imbalances of power in TV industry, and I just wondered what your view was on the way the BBC's handled the allegations surrounding Hugh Edwards and his resignation, and if you think it should release some of the results of its fact-finding mission into his behaviour.
Three totally different, have you got them all there?
Yeah.
So first of all, politicisation of key appointments.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. there's obviously been a lot of discussion and scandal. I mean, scandal's probably too strong a word, but a lot of concern around this in recent years. I am concerned when like, for example, over the chair of Ofcom, for example, that was a whole process that went on for a really long time, and it did feel like there was some sort of political interference going on there, and I just feel that that's got to be. It just looks. The optics of that. It just feels so inappropriate. We have to do everything we can to ensure that those organisations which are supposed to hold everyone to account have to be seen to be as. We know that people have political viewpoints. I don't have a problem with Robbie Gibb being on the board of the BBC. I don't have a problem with that. And he says he never tried to interfere with Newsnight. So I mean, it's a different reports of what happened. But I just feel that everybody needs to do their very best in a world where people are just so concerned about whether there is a political aspect to these organisations. We have to go above and beyond to try and demonstrate that they're as independent as possible. I think that's...
You are of the party in power.
Yes.
Are there things you can do behind the scenes that you might not want us to know about, but actually it's important for the Conservatives to actually be seen to get it?
Yes, probably, I think that was that particular part of our sort of leadership history was slightly different. She said, trying to be incredibly diplomatic now that she knows there's a journalist in the audience, So I think things are slightly different now.
Children and
children. That's really interesting. One of the things we're looking at, actually, funnily enough, as part of our inquiry into film and high-end TV, is the fact that in some countries there's a levy on streamers that goes into film and TV production. In France, it's quite substantial, actually, but they do also have it in Australia and New Zealand. So it is one of the things we're looking at as part of that inquiry. But the children's content one is actually a really interesting suggestion, because the quality of children's TV is just... I mean, it's significantly changed, hasn't it? My dad, as you know, used to do a children's television program called How in the 70s, 80s, 90s. It stopped, and then they brought it back a few years ago with a new cast and new younger cast. And my dad would do like a little sort of cameo appearance on it, and it lasted 2 seasons. Because actually it's so much cheaper to bring over like American cartoons than it is to make that sort of quality children's TV programming that we all grew up with. And people like Tim Peake have told my dad that the reason he became an astronaut is because he was inspired to get into science on that TV show.
So you've taken that on board.
Yeah, that's really good. I love that. What was the last one? Hugh Edwards.
It's Hugh Edwards.
Yeah, I mean, this feels really difficult. I mean, the BBC are in a really, really difficult position over things like this, because at the point that the allegations were made last summer, it was unclear as to exactly who was making the allegations and exactly what they were. It turns out now, of course, that the way that Hugh Edwards was conducting himself was outside of work time, on his own equipment, and it was a consensual activity with someone who was of age. So actually nothing, as much as it may be distasteful to some, it was nothing illegal happened, and he's entitled to a private life, right? And so it just feels that I feel very sorry for him, and I feel particularly sorry for his family, and whether there's anything more that the BBC could have done to have changed that, I don't know. But it's a horrible... It feels fundamentally wrong that someone's whole life has been damaged so irrevocably by something like that.
Got time for just one question. I'm going to give it to Professor Sylvia Harvey at the back. Hold your hand up. That's right. Yeah.
Thanks very much. I'm Sylvia Harvey. I'm University of Leeds and VLV trustee. It's a brief political philosophical question, if you don't mind. In 2012, that was the year in which all British broadcasters finally went digital. And it's also the year in which Netflix entered the market in the United Kingdom. And the question is it not now the case that the more the choice, the less the quality?
I was thinking, this is so interesting that you asked me this question as the last one. I was thinking about this morning as I was wandering down here, that actually when I grew up in, this is going to make me sound like a real Luddite, but I grew up in a world where there were 4 television channels, and there was always something to watch, and we all shared cultural references, and we'd all go into school the next day and sort of reenact what we'd seen on, I don't know, Battlestar Galactica or Red Dwarf or whatever it was the next day. We'd sort of, we'd repeat the lines, yeah. And these days it feels like we have so much more choice, and yet there's very little that I want to watch. And actually, one of my kids said to me the other day, Mum, I think growing up in the 80s, you grew up in like a really brilliant time for culture, in that you shared cultural references with all your peers at school, because these days everyone is watching something entirely different, and unless you get these sort of real you get these moments which just go viral, but other than that, they don't have the same sort of shared cultural experiences that we had growing up, and there is a sadness about that. And there obviously, in the modern world, there is still brilliant content being made by by the streamers, by the terrestrials, by everybody. There is wonderful content still coming out, but if you take on one hand how much more we now have and how much the quality has changed, I don't think that they have necessarily gone up at the same level.
Dame Caroline, thank you very much. Would you please give her a round of applause? Thank you.